And now the shipping forecast issued by the Met Office at 05:05 on Thursday, the 5th of February 2004. There are warnings of gales in Forties, Dogger, Fisher, German Bight and Fair Isle. The area forecast for the next 24 hours.
Hey lads, what are you doing? Don't go in there! Tide's coming in!
Irish Sea.
A big rescue operation is underway in Morecambe Bay in Lancashire, where 22 cockle-pickers have been caught by the incoming tide. They're up to their necks or waists in the freezing cold water. It's believed they're all Chinese.
I'm Chinese boys from Morecambe Bay. And the Scotland. And they need pain or something, you're going to have to get them out of there.
"23 people drowned."
These were people with wives, with husbands, with children, that there were orphans now in China.
Illegal immigrants living and working in appalling conditions.
The reality, it's not what they were told. They could be paid anything, and they can't argue with the boss. They just have to take whatever they can lay their hands on.
Living in fear of the gangsters who had smuggled them into the UK.
You don't want to be talking about what these people do, because they run huge multi-million-pound criminal businesses, and life is worth nothing to them.
The deaths of 23 Chinese cockle-pickers here on Morecambe Sands shocked Britain. Not only did it shine a light on the hidden world of human trafficking, it also exposed the appalling conditions suffered by those scratching a living to put food on our plates. The case would spark a government investigation into people smuggling rackets, but in the hours immediately after the tragedy, Lancashire police faced more urgent questions. Just who were the people who had drowned, and who had sent them to their deaths?
The victims were among legions of cocklers who had hit Morecambe's beaches in early 2004. The Irish Sea had provided a bumper harvest of shellfish, and buyers were queuing up in Britain and on the continent. Big demand meant the potential for big profits. But if seafood suppliers were to meet that demand, they needed cockle-pickers who could work around the clock.
If you'd said to me before it all started that you could make money out of these little shellfish on the beach, I wouldn't have believed you. But when you see what draws that number of people to a beach, and you see people walking about with large wads of cash being doled out from buyers with even bigger piles of cash, it's quite an eye-opener.
Among the most willing workers were the Chinese. Gangs of up to 70 of them had first appeared on Morecambe's beaches a year earlier. They worked late into the night and in the harshest conditions. It was both backbreaking and dangerous. Many of the cockle beds were miles from the shoreline. To reach them, cocklers had to negotiate treacherous ground. Large expanses of quicksand could easily suck up a vehicle completely. Even tractors and transits have been known to become totally submerged. Then there were the water channels to deal with. To the untrained eye, the sands may appear flat, but the deep channels between the cockle beds and the shore can fill rapidly.
All estuaries are dangerous, but Morecambe Bay is, I would think, more dangerous than most because it's such a vast expansion. The tide comes in as fast as a horse can gallop on the high tides, and changing the whole situation of the river. You cannot come out here and say, well, I know the way. People have been with me, you know, they come year after year, but they cannot say that, because every time you come out here, it's different.
On the night of the tragedy, the big cockling operators stayed at home. Unpredictable tides and freezing weather meant it would be risky to go out onto the sands for more than a few hours. But the harsh conditions didn't seem to deter one Chinese gang. Late that afternoon, a group of around 30 were spotted making their way out towards the sea.
They probably wouldn't know about the tide conditions with the bad weather. They might have had a tide table and been able to read it, but the tide should have been probably coming back at 9 o'clock, and it was probably coming back at about 7:30, and that's what the problem was. Anybody who was out on a night like that were desperation measures going out, I think.
Local fisherman Trevor Fleming was the last person to have contact with the cocklers. He spotted them at about 6 p.m. as he was packing up and heading back to shore. Experience told him they were heading for danger.
Hey lads, what are you doing? Don't go in there! Tide's coming in! Don't do it! Don't go cockling! Tide's coming in!
I tried to communicate one of the Chinese workers to explain that he was going to be pushing his luck and that the tide was coming in. He just put his rake on his shoulder, smiled at me and walked off into the dark that night. I run through to the farm that I operate from and said, I think if any time that there's going to be an accident, I think it's possibly going to be tonight. They're still walking out there, and I don't think they're going to be able to walk back in time.
As the Chinese worked away into the night, they were unaware they were being surrounded by rising waters that would soon cut off their route back to shore.
It crept up behind them, and then it came up the other one, secondary. So they knew nothing that night. You can't hear out there the tide when there's a wind blowing. They knew nothing, working away, cockling, until the water was all around. They were circled, and there's just nowhere to run.
The channels fill up first. If the water's more than wading depth, you've got to swim for it. And there's no way you'd swim in them conditions. You'd probably have to try and swim 400 or 500 yards, 600 yards, in really bad conditions.
As the water began to rise, panic set in. The cocklers realised they were trapped. Unaware of how to contact the emergency services, some frantically phoned friends and family, both in England and in China, in an attempt to raise the alarm. Meanwhile, Coast Guards got their first inkling of trouble. An off-duty lifeboatman reported seeing a vehicle driving around erratically in the bay.
The first report only said 4 young people going out on a vehicle, so we thought it might just be 4 people. We didn't know if they'd actually stopped and turned round, but the lifeboatman said he couldn't see their lights anymore, the lights of the vehicle. So for the first call, it wasn't unfolding as a tragedy. It was 13 minutes past 9, and high water was 11 o'clock that night, so it was exactly the wrong time to be going out onto the bay. That was the first alert that something was wrong.
Within minutes, the Coast Guard received a second call, this time from an English woman. She said she knew a group of cockle-pickers were trapped out in the bay.
I have got a load of Chinese boys in Morecambe Bay, and they're stuck.
And how many are out there, do you know?
There's a lot, and they need a plane or something. You're going to have to get them on today.
Right, they've been on the cockle bed, have they, at Morecambe Bay?
Yeah, cockle bed, Morecambe Bay. Can you please?
The Coast Guard launched an immediate search and rescue operation, calling in all branches of the emergency services. But even with 3 helicopters, heat-seeking cameras, a lifeboat and a hovercraft, the rescuers knew the chances of finding anyone alive were slim. Freezing waters meant that anyone who tried to swim to safety would be dead within minutes. Conditions were so bad that night that the rescuers were even risking their own lives during the search.
We had to pull the hovercraft back onto the beach. It couldn't operate. It was nearly capsized twice on the way to the scene. So we struggled with the hovercraft, and the boat, the lads on the boat said it was like being in a washing machine. It was very bad.
It can be very, very difficult searching for people in the water. At night time, you're looking for a dark head, because the head will be wet in the dark sea at night, and it's very, very difficult unless they have some aids to finding them. It's almost impossible.
Out in the bay, most of the cocklers were now in the water, still frantically trying to summon help. But the emergency services had no clue as to their exact position. At 9:30, they did manage to make contact with one of the trapped cocklers, but all they could make out was a drowning man's last desperate pleas for help.
Hello? Right, please, please. Sticky Walker!
Even though we couldn't understand what he was saying, we could tell by the tone of his voice he was very, very distressed. And it was awful in the ops room at that time. You could tell a tragedy was unfolding by then.
Hello?
If you can put yourself in their position at that night when they're cut off, it's a pitch black night, pitch black sea all around you. Morecambe Bay is vast, but there are towns all the way around. So you'll see lights in almost every direction that you look, and then if you do turn the wrong way, you've got miles and miles of sea to cross and you will not make it.
At 10 p.m, the police helicopter spotted one cockler stranded on Priest Skier, an outcrop of rock a mile out from the shore.
We have visual with one person only at this stage.
An RNLI hovercraft raced to the scene, and 2 lifeboatmen later got the survivor safely on board. The Coast Guards had been told there were dozens of cocklers out that night. They didn't know exactly how many. As their search continued, their hopes faded.
I mean, obviously, when it gets to 3 and 4 hours that people have been missing in water at that time of year, you really are looking as a recovery mission rather than a rescue mission. And obviously, when after the first casualty was found dead, or obviously dead, that yeah, we're looking for more bodies really.
As the tide receded, 19 bodies were picked up from the bay.
They wouldn't have a chance at all. They'd stripped off and tried to swim for it. But it was a long swim in big waves, icy water. They would no chance at all. It's not very pleasant, is it? Knowing that they were all lads who had seen working. There was nothing wrong with them. They were working very close to where we were once or twice.
Lucky survivors who had managed to scramble to shore were found on or near the beach. They were wet, freezing and terrified. Traumatised, as were the rescue workers and many of the locals.
I never slept one wink that night or the next night, thinking about how those poor souls got drowned. So cold out there, the tide came in so fast around them, they'd be screaming and shouting, they wouldn't have known what to do, nowhere to go.
As dawn broke, the police arrived. A small-town tragedy would soon become a worldwide criminal investigation, leading detectives to China and to the heart of a people smuggling operation here in Britain.
Now then, this time last night, as darkness fell, a group of Chinese workers...
The day after the horrific night before, 19 bodies had been recovered, 11 survivors were being treated, and 2 questions were paramount. What were the identities of the cockle-pickers, and who had sent them out in such treacherous conditions? Within hours, detectives had declared it a manslaughter inquiry. They knew the case would present unique challenges.
Usually with most cases, You've got a street to go to and you've got people to speak to who you know, and you usually know the name of the person who's dead, and there's lots of witnesses, and you've got a very good background of what's happened. In this case, we've got no idea who's dead, where from, we don't know who's been organising it, and as we learn out that these are Chinese people and they're probably illegal immigrants, we start hearing these words about snakeheads and triads. So every single element of the inquiry we were starting from scratch from.
At this stage, the police had picked up 11 Chinese nationals and 1 Englishwoman. Immigration checks revealed that most of the Chinese victims and survivors had entered the country illegally. Officers had recovered their fishing permits, all bearing false names, but getting explanations from the survivors was proving tough.
Mainly they are frightened Chinese illegal immigrants who are scared of the authorities, who aren't speaking to us. We've got difficulties over language and culture, and we're aware they've been threatened, so we need to speak to those.
How are we doing? I've got 4 names so far, various ages. That's about as far as I've got. Right. How are we all feeling?
The few answers the survivors gave made little sense, and their explanation for being out in the bay on that cold February night was clearly a lie.
The initial witnesses said they'd been on a picnic, and it was quite apparent at that time that something serious had got on, but it was going to take a heck of a lot of work to get to the truth of what had happened.
As the questioning went on, police began to suspect that some survivors were being intimidated by other members of the group.
An experienced detective inspector came to me and said he thought there was 4 of the group who appeared to be the organisers from the way they were sat, the demeanour, and the fact that everyone else was cowering and seemed to look at these 4 as to what they should say to us. And just off body language, it looked like we could identify who the organisers were.
Those suspected organisers were later placed under arrest. 3 were Chinese, the 4th was an Englishwoman, Janie Bannister.
I have got a load of Chinese boys in Morecambe bed, and they're stuck.
Police quickly identified her as the woman who had alerted the Coast Guard.
And how many are out there, do you know?
There's a lot, and they need a plane or something. You're going to have to get them out today.
Detectives saw that she too was being put under intense pressure.
Very quickly we interviewed Janie Bannister, who'd been there on the night and was a girlfriend of one of the Chinese. She was 5 months pregnant, and she said to us, "I want to tell you the truth of what's happened." And she told us that the main man was also in the cells, but he was giving us false details.
Janie Bannister then agreed to give a full statement, pointing the finger at 2 men, her boyfriend Lin Mu Yong and his cousin, the alleged gangmaster Lin Liang Ren. According to her, Ren had received a large order for cockles from a local seafood supplier. Rather than turn that order down, he'd made his workers walk out onto Morecambe Bay in life-threatening conditions. The police now had something to go on. On the night of the tragedy, police found Ren walking along a road 2 miles from the beach, but he flatly denied being involved in the incident. This contradicted Janie Bannister's claim that Ren was in charge and had been waiting at the shore as the workers walked out to sea. The police believed Janie, who they no longer suspected of any wrongdoing, but hers was a lone voice. All the other survivors backed Ren's version of events.
No admissions were coming from anywhere else, so it was quite clear at that early stage we were going to have to prove everything, because basically it was Janie's word against everyone else, and the allegation was she was only saying that to kind of get out of custody and get out of trouble.
With Ren denying everything, detectives desperately needed the other survivors to talk, but 3 days of questioning brought nothing. Reluctantly, they handed the survivors over to the care of the asylum service.
It was quite clear that people had been told to lie and intimidated to lie. I mean, the survivors are in a foreign country. They're reliant on their managers, organisers for where to live. So they're very much beholden to them, and they were told without any doubt, you won't identify who the proper leader is, and you'll blame the people who were dead.
Breaking down this protective wall of silence surrounding Ren was going to be long and arduous. The survivors were scared, not just of Ren, but of the police themselves.
They just didn't realise that we would, despite the fact that they came here illegally, offer them as much protection as we legitimately could within the bounds of the law to ensure that they were kept safe, kept secure, and able to testify against Lin Liang Ran.
They did not know whether the police was there to help the immigration to get them back into China. They were not sure what's going to happen. On top of that, they were frightened of the defendant.
But the job of the police was about to become even harder. Within hours of being handed to the asylum service, the survivors all fled.
Oh, great. Listen, have you got any idea where they've gone?
Detectives now had no way of proving Janie Bannister's story.
It was a major blow that all these witnesses had gone.
Yeah, it's me. No, they've gone. You've got no idea where they might have gone. Oh, great.
The media and the country are looking at us to find out how 23 people have died, and our main people who can tell us have just gone.
Yeah. Come on, might as well go.
It was the crucial part of the inquiry that we traced these witnesses again, and we got their assistance, and they told us the truth. Without them, we didn't have anything, and we needed them, and we also needed the help of the hidden Chinese communities that were in this country at the time, so that we could deliver to the criminal justice system the evidence in this case.
First of all, the witnesses, those surviving witnesses, some of them gave what were patently false accounts of what had gone on. Then almost immediately after the event, some of those witnesses disappeared. So we had a case that, on the one hand, appeared to be contradictory, and then before our eyes was disappearing. So it looked, I have to say, very unpromising.
Tracking down the survivors wasn't going to be easy. As illegal immigrants, they were used to living life under the radar of the authorities. Police dispatched officers to London's Chinatown and to other Chinese communities across the UK. They also issued appeals through the Chinese media.
So I had to talk to different Chinese free newspapers, as well as the criminal elements, to get the contact into the Chinese community. And it was the whole team bringing all these things together that gave people the confidence that we were going to treat them fairly, but also that we actually wanted to do something about it and we weren't going to go away.
But despite all their efforts in Britain, the breakthrough for the police was to come 5,000 miles away. 6 days after the tragedy, finally they were able to identify the stranded cockle-picker who had made the frantic phone call while drowning.
Hello, this is the police. Where are you?
A newspaper published a front-page picture of the man's family holding up his photograph. His name was Guo Bin Long. He'd arrived in Britain 12 months earlier. The truck driver had left behind a wife, a son, and an adoptive daughter, hoping to make enough money to give them a better life. But those dreams had ended on Morecambe Sands on February the 5th, 2004. That night, as well as calling the emergency services, he'd also phoned his family.
We were all still asleep except for his parents. They were up. He said that he is now in great danger. and he was asking his mother to pray for him. He didn't give any details, he just said, "I am in the sea now, and the water is up to my neck. Pray for me." And then the sound disappeared. His mother then came and woke us up, and we started to pray for him while waiting for his phone call, but nothing came.
The identification of Guo Bin Long helped the authorities discover the names of other victims. And one by one, their tragic stories also emerged.
The more we investigated the background and circumstances of the people that had been killed, these were people with wives, with husbands, with children, that there were orphans now in China as a consequence of this.
Xu Bing was one of those orphans. His father had left home 6 years earlier. His mother had travelled to Britain to be reunited with him just 2 weeks before. This photograph of the couple was taken at Morecambe Bay by one of the survivors of the tragedy. They'd called their son only hours before they died.
They rang to say they brought me new clothes, a tradition for the Chinese Lantern Festival the next day, and they said they sent them to me. I told them they needn't work so hard. I told them you can earn money step by step.
Many of the other victims were also breadwinners. Their deaths had plunged their families into even deeper poverty, making the authorities in Britain even more determined to prosecute those responsible.
I think the whole of the legal team, and certainly the investigative team, what we felt was, if this was my son, my daughter, no matter what they'd done, I'd want justice for them. And that's how we felt. We wanted to achieve justice not only for the people who lost their lives, but also for their families.
In the months following the Morecambe Bay tragedy, police gradually managed to identify most of the 23 dead cockle-pickers, men and women, all aged between 18 and 45. But if they were going to get justice for their families, they still needed to track down the survivors and persuade them to testify against the alleged gangmaster, Lin Liang Ren.
The hunt for those key witnesses would lead them to one of the oldest Chinese communities in Britain, and it would bring detectives face to face with one of the leading members of the feared Chinese underworld.
It was a rather bizarre conversation, because it was one of those conversations of, I know that you know that I know what you're doing, but I want your help.
2 months after the Morecambe Bay tragedy, detectives were still trying to trace the survivors. All were believed to be illegal immigrants, frightened not only of the police, but of the criminal gangs who had smuggled them into the UK and put them to work. At the heart of this people trafficking network were the so-called snakehead gangs. They recruit workers from China, all willing to pay for the promise of a better life in Britain.
If you pay about £15,000, you'll come over a land route from China through the Ukraine, through to mainland Europe, and then probably end up in the back of a wagon being transported through the Channel Tunnel, and you come into this country. And that when you get here, there are job opportunities in the restaurant trade, massage parlours, or picking food. And it's a business that is so well organised.
Once in Britain, the workers earn a pittance, with most of their wages being used to repay the debts they incurred in getting here. Morecambe Bay victim Guo Bin Long had barely enough money left to feed himself.
He wants to earn more money and pay the debts back quickly. Sometimes he has to work during the night because sometimes there is a night tide. Sometimes he has to spend the night at the seaside with just a piece of bread for food.
In reality, it's not what they were told by those who organized them to come into this country. It's much harder. They found without work permit, they cannot be protected by the law. There's no such thing it's called minimum wage. They could be paid anything, and they can't argue with the boss. They just have to take whatever they can lay their hands on. So life is extraordinarily hard for them.
Detectives discovered that the Morecambe Bay cocklers had been living in Liverpool, home of Britain's oldest Chinese community. It was a far cry from the life the snakehead gangs had promised them back in China.
A lot of the Chinese people we spoke to, before they came to England, had a picture of this country being very similar to the Darling Buds of May. And then they end up in a house in Liverpool where there are 30 people to a room, often having fallouts with local people, and it's not what they expected.
Even before they started to live in the accommodation where was provided by the boss of the cockle-pickers, they had already experienced sharing a floor with many people who they do not know, a mixed sex. There's no privacy or personal. It just doesn't exist. Somewhere to sleep, somewhere to work, and hope that your boss is going to be decent enough to pay you. That's their daily task.
While building up a picture of the lives led by the Chinese workers, the police also discovered more about their alleged gangmaster, Lin Liang Ren. A trained accountant back in China, he'd arrived in Britain in 2000, meeting up with relatives in Liverpool. Posing as a student, he persuaded the immigration service to support his application to stay in the UK. Although it was not known whether he had any links to the people smugglers, it was clear that he was building up a criminal empire using illegal workers, forging cockling permits for his expanding workforce of illegal immigrants and supplying them with false national insurance numbers. It brought him a comfortable lifestyle that contrasted starkly with those who worked for him.
The workers were living 6 or 12 to a room with one toilet, perhaps between 20 or so people, with limited food, limited heating, limited clothing. He, Lin Liang Ren, had got a sports car. He lived with a girlfriend in kind of one room or a number of rooms, and basically he lived the high life. He went out for nice meals, and his particular passion was going to the casino, and he spent thousands of pounds down at the casino. One of the witnesses saw him gamble £650 on one hand the night before the tragedy.
In his original interview, Ren claimed to know nothing about the cocklers on Morecambe Sands.
You were there, weren't you?
Later, he changed his story to say he had been there, but had merely been looking after the vehicles as the workers waded out towards the sea. But as time went on, evidence against him began to mount. Investigations showed that he had actually bought the vehicles used by the cocklers, and evidence from company paperwork showed he'd been doing big deals with seafood suppliers.
He saw a real opportunity to make a lot of money, and he was prepared to exploit the people that worked for him in order to make that money for himself. He knew that these were people who simply couldn't turn to anyone for help.
Do you want to count it?
Don't worry, I trust you.
There was also evidence that Ren had a motive to send his workers out in those appalling conditions. He had agreed to supply 2 lorry loads of cockles for a dealer on the night of the tragedy. But was all this enough to convict him?
The key evidence that we needed was the evidence from the people who'd actually been out there on that bay that night, or those people who worked for Lin Liang Ren and could say that he was the person who was the boss. So without them, it would have been a significant uphill struggle.
But finding those people was proving impossible. Despite all the efforts to persuade the surviving cocklers to come forward, they remained hidden, terrified of the snakehead gangs that had smuggled them here illegally. But in the end, it was the greed of those gangs that gave the police their vital breakthrough.
Once they'd transported their workers to Britain, the snakeheads wanted paying, and regularly. The cocklers were all given a monthly wage, but as soon as they received it, they had to make payments into bank accounts.
We can see that the money that is made by illegal workers is put into bank accounts. Chinese workers go in with account numbers in mobile phones, hand them over to a cashier, and the money goes into the banking system. And we were able to trace through that hundreds of thousands of pounds were going to one particular account, and then about £1 million a day was leaving the UK to go to China. Now that's not just from cockling, that's from all sorts of illegal immigrant activity.
Inquiries identified a key figure at the heart of one such financial network, a man already known to police. In a bold move, Mick Gradwell decided to turn to him for help.
This was a very delicate inquiry because this person looks like he's leading illegal Chinese crime in the country. He's someone who's been targeted by the main crime agencies of the country. And whilst that was outside the remit of my investigation, I had to speak to these other agencies to make sure they were okay with me going to speak to him and to make these inquiries to see if he would assist us.
Once Gradwell received the all clear, a meeting was set up.
It was a rather bizarre conversation because it was one of those conversations of, I know that I know what you're doing, but I want your help.
Do you recognise any of the names on that list?
I've got 23 people dead in Lancashire, and I think you're a person who can help me and who can assist me in locating some named people that I want to speak to.
Look, I'm just a humble northern copper that needs help tracking down his witnesses. And you're the person that might be able to help me do that.
And we had quite an amiable conversation, and he obviously went away and thought about what I had to say to him.
Within hours of the meeting, the first of the missing survivors turned up. Police believe it was no coincidence.
It was the right way of doing it. It wasn't the sole thing that did it. It was the inquiries in the community. But by seeing the main man, I think it pulled the right strings to ensure that we got the first witness forward.
Over the next 12 months, police re-established contact with all but one of the missing survivors, but they still had to persuade them to tell the truth about their feared gangmaster, Lin Liang Ren. To help win their trust, they appointed interpreter Dawn Teal. Over the coming months, she would build close relationships with the survivors.
When we first travelled around the country to meet all the witnesses, I would say almost all the first round of meetings happened to be fruitless because they were very cautious, very frightened. They do not understand the legal procedure in this country. They don't know whether the police are going to help the Home Office to deport them. And also as a fear of the revenge. They were worried that the snakehead or the gangsters might harm them, their children, their family, for revealing what everybody else ought not to know.
Can you ask him how many people were on the beach at the time?
Despite these fears, some of the survivors did begin to talk. The police were finally getting to the truth of what happened at Morecambe Bay and Ren's part in it.
When we first found out what happened on the night, it was clear that this was going to be a pressurised night. Half the workforce didn't set off because some of the vehicles broke down. When they got to Morecambe on the night, they got there too late. As soon as they got out there, one of the vehicles got stuck, and every single thing with that night's events went wrong from the very start.
Interviews with the survivors supported the statement from Janie Bannister made in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. Like her, they claimed Ren had ordered them out in the appalling weather conditions and that he was on the shore when the tide cut them off. When one cockler had returned shocked and freezing, Ren had refused to let him in his car to shelter from the cold. He also ordered the rest of the survivors to cover up his involvement before trying to flee from the scene.
From the workers who were there that night and the ones who'd worked with him in the months coming up to the incident, it was quite clear they had little regard for the safety of his workers. There was one particular incident where the workers were out and the tide was coming in, and somebody became concerned they weren't coming in quick enough, and he just said, "Leave it to God." And it just showed that he didn't care, and the only thing that mattered to him was making money.
The police now had the evidence they needed to bring a prosecution, but persuading their witnesses to appear in court was another matter. Wren had allegedly warned of harmful consequences for anyone who cooperated with detectives, and some survivors were clearly coming under intense pressure not to testify.
They would just say, look, I just received a phone call from my wife or from my father. Is that going to be true? Will he be able to come and harm anybody in my family? What's going to happen? I have no idea. Could you please tell me? Well, I wasn't in a position to give any advice. All I could do was sit in there and listen.
Detectives finally charged Wren with 23 counts of manslaughter, and his trial at Preston Crown Court was set for September 2005. But if the survivors were not prepared to go into the witness box, the police knew a conviction was far from certain. 2 years after the Morecambe Bay tragedy, the case finally reached court. In the months leading up to Lin Liang Ren's manslaughter trial, many survivors had been warned not to testify against him. And having lost the witnesses once already, the police weren't taking any risks.
We had to do continual risk assessments on so many areas throughout the investigation. The Chinese witnesses who were intending to give evidence were naturally putting themselves and the families in danger, because these big criminal organisations could have, if they've wanted, have caused lots of problems with the families.
Well, once the case is put in the hands of the jury, you just have to hope that they've seen the case and appreciated the evidence in the way that you wanted them to. But of course, you just never know until the verdict comes back. You still have that anxiety that, well, maybe the jury just didn't see it the way we saw it.
11 out of the 12 survivors did eventually testify. Wren was found guilty of manslaughter and facilitation of illegal immigrants. He was sentenced to 14 years. The British dealers whom he had been supplying were exonerated of any blame in the tragedy.
Don't worry, I trust you.
I always think at this time it can never replace their loved one. But I hope that they see that we care, that the criminal justice system has worked, and I hope it just gives them any crumb of comfort that it possibly can.
As the clerk read out each charge of manslaughter and the foreperson said guilty, you know, it was really an emotional time, and particularly when you remember all the difficulties with this particular case.
For the survivors who had testified against Wren, the feelings were mixed. They'd all been granted temporary asylum in the UK, but they remained fearful of reprisals.
Almost each one of them, they'll ask how long will he be locked up for, and what's going to happen next to us. Will Ren be let out soon? Will we be in danger? Those were very common questions from each one of them.
For the families of the victims, the trial verdict brought little comfort. They built up massive debts in order to pay off the snakeheads, but having lost their main breadwinner, many are unable to pay those debts back.
We owe a lot of money. Now the body has been sent back, the debt collectors are coming almost every day. All we can do is postpone it day by day.
Orphaned children are faced with having to pay the debt owed by their parents.
How can I put up with a pain like this all of a sudden? I'm only 15, not an adult. There's no agricultural work at home, so there's no need for me to stay at home. By going to school, I might get skills for the future, and we pay the debts for my father and mother.
For some, the grief and the debts have proved too much. The mother of Guo Bin Long, the man who made the frantic 999 call while drowning, has since committed suicide. Here in Britain, his words continue to haunt all those who worked on the case.
That one phone call where he's repeating over and over, sinking water, because they're only the English words he can say. And you can hear in the background the moans and groans of the people who are with him. In fact, you can hear people drowning. You just feel helpless, the fact that you couldn't help him because you couldn't understand what he was saying or where he was. And that one phone call portrays the very worst of what happened on that night in Morecambe Bay.
The whole implication, the impact becomes stronger on me each time when I heard the very word Morecambe or cockle. My body reacts differently. It sometimes just shuts me down completely.